Elena Morales offered $200 for permission to demolish a crumbling stone tower that had stood empty for over a century. The landowner laughed and said she'd pay Elena double that amount to make it disappear. But when Elena's young apprentice climbed inside to assess the structure, what she found carved into those ancient walls would shake the entire Silverstone Valley to its core. The tower stood at the edge of Silverstone Valley like a monument to something deliberately forgotten. 40 feet of weathered gray limestone, moss-covered and leaning slightly toward the north as if bowing under the weight of its own secrets. No one in the valley remembered who built it or when, though the oldest residents claimed it had been there since before their grandparents were born. Local stories varied wildly. Some said it was a grain silo from the 1800s. Others insisted it was a watchtower built during some long-forgotten conflict, and a few whispered it was the remains of an eccentric hermit's fortress. What everyone agreed on was that the tower was an eyesore, a liability, and long overdue for demolition. The rancher who owned the land, a stern woman named Victoria Brennan, had been trying to get rid of it for nearly a decade. Insurance companies flagged it as a hazard. Teenagers dared each other to climb its crumbling exterior. Hunters complained it spooked the deer. The stone itself, however, was valuable. Good quality limestone, the kind that could be repurposed for foundations, garden walls, or sold to restoration projects across the territory. Worth real money if you knew how to harvest it properly. Elena Morales knew how. She had been a stonemason for 28 years, one of only 3 certified female masons in the entire western region. She'd built ranch walls that still stood after flash floods, repaired century-old homesteads with such precision that you couldn't tell new stone from old, and earned a reputation for being thorough, fair, and uncompromising in her craft. But lately, work had dried up like a streambed in August. The construction boom had ended. Ranchers were tightening their belts. Young men with cheaper rates and less experience were undercutting her bids. Elena was down to her last contract and facing a winter with nothing lined up except debt and doubt. When she heard through a friend that Victoria Brennan wanted the old tower demolished, Elena saw an opportunity. She drafted a proposal, $200 for exclusive salvage rights, permission to tear down the structure, keep the stone, and sell whatever she could recover. It was a fair offer. The stone alone could fetch $800 to $1,000 if she worked it right, and that would carry her through until spring when construction work picked up again. She met Victoria Brennan at the base of the tower on a cold October morning. The sky was the color of lead, threatening rain but withholding it, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant wood smoke. Victoria arrived in a mud-splattered truck, stepping out with the kind of economical movement that spoke of a woman who didn't waste energy on unnecessary gestures. She was in her mid-60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that evaluated everything with the precision of an accountant reviewing a questionable expense report. Elena handed her the proposal letter. Victoria scanned it once, then looked up with an expression that Elena couldn't quite read. Not anger, not amusement. Something closer to relief mixed with something darker. You're offering to pay me to tear this thing down? Victoria's voice was flat, revealing nothing. The stone's worth money, Elena said evenly. Good limestone, clean cuts, minimal weathering on the interior blocks. I can move it, process it, and sell it within 3 months. Victoria folded the letter with deliberate care and handed it back. I'll pay you $400 to make it disappear. Cash. And I'll provide equipment if you need it. Elena blinked, certain she'd misheard. You'll pay me? Double what you offered. I want it gone, Morales. Gone and forgotten. I don't care what you do with the stone. Sell it. Bury it. Build yourself a chapel with it. Just get it off my land before Christmas. There was something in Victoria's tone that raised the hair on the back of Elena's neck. An urgency that went far beyond aesthetics or insurance concerns. Elena had heard desperation before. Men behind on loans, families losing their homesteads, but this was different. This sounded like fear wrapped in a businesswoman's composure. Why the rush? Elena asked carefully. Victoria's jaw muscle twitched, just once. Because it's been here long enough. Because every year someone gets hurt climbing it or exploring it, and I'm tired of the liability. Because I'm selling this section of land in the spring, and the buyers won't touch it with that eyesore standing. The reasons came out smooth and practiced, but her eyes told a different story. They didn't quite meet Elena's. And because, Victoria added, her voice dropping slightly. Some things are better left in the past. Understand? Elena didn't understand, not really, but she recognized the edge in Victoria's voice. The kind of edge that meant the conversation was over and further questions wouldn't be welcome. Victoria pulled a contract from her truck, already prepared, already filled out except for Elena's signature. The terms were generous to the point of being suspicious. For $100 payment up front, keep all salvage materials, complete demolition required within 60 days, and a bizarre clause at the bottom stating that Elena would dispose of any discovered materials, objects, or documentation in a manner consistent with standard demolition practices without preservation or archival. That last clause stuck in Elena's mind like a splinter, but $400 was $400, and she'd learned long ago not to question good fortune too closely. She signed. Victoria handed over a check that same morning, shook Elena's hand with a grip like iron, and drove away without looking back at the tower. Not even a glance. Elena stood alone at the base of the structure, contract in hand, and felt the first whisper of unease settle over her like morning frost. What kind of building weighed so heavily on a woman's conscience that she'd pay someone to erase it? Elena returned 3 days later with her apprentice, a young woman named Carmen who'd been learning the trade for just over a year. Carmen was 22, whip-smart, with the kind of boundless energy that made older workers feel simultaneously inspired and exhausted. She stood at the base of the tower with her hands on her hips, head tilted back, eyes tracing the stonework with the focused intensity of someone genuinely interested in the craft. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing, Carmen said, admiration clear in her voice. Look at those joints, Elena. Tight as anything. No visible mortar in half the seams. That's master-level work. Elena nodded slowly. The craftsmanship was exceptional, almost suspiciously so for a structure that supposedly had no clear purpose. The stones fit together with barely a hairline gap, each one cut and placed with precision that spoke of someone who understood not just how to stack rocks, but how to make them last centuries. The tower had weathered over 100 winters without collapsing, without significant structural damage beyond surface erosion. That required knowledge, skill, and resources. Strange that nobody remembers who built it, Elena said quietly, more to herself than to Carmen. Maybe they didn't want to be remembered, Carmen replied, then caught herself. Sorry, that sounded dramatic. I've been reading too many mystery novels. Elena smiled, but the comment lodged itself in her mind alongside Victoria's strange urgency and that peculiar contract clause. Let's see what we're dealing with inside, Elena said, pulling on her work gloves. The entrance was a narrow archway on the southern face, half-choked with decades of dead vines, wind-blown debris, and the skeletal remains of a bird's nest. Elena pulled the growth away methodically, revealing a threshold worn smooth by time and weather. The opening was barely wide enough for one person, designed either for defense or secrecy. She couldn't tell which. She stepped through. Carmen followed, carrying a battery-powered work light that cast harsh white illumination into the interior. The space inside was darker than it should have been. The tower had no roof. It had either collapsed decades ago or been deliberately removed, but the walls rose high enough that direct sunlight only touched a narrow circle in the center of the floor, leaving the curved edges in deep, permanent shadow. The air inside was cold, several degrees colder than outside, and it smelled of damp stone, earth, and something faintly metallic that reminded Elena of old iron tools left to rust in a barn. Carmen swept the work light across the interior, and both women froze simultaneously. The walls were covered in carvings. Not decorative carvings. Not the idle scratching of bored teenagers or the folk art you might find in old barns. These were deliberate, methodical, obsessive. Names, dates, symbols, hundreds upon hundreds of them, carved into the stone at every conceivable height, layered over each other in places where space ran out, stretching from the floor to heights that would have required scaffolding to reach. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across the nearest section of wall. The carvings were deep, each letter cut with precision into the limestone, the kind of work that would have taken hours per inscription. The nearest carving read, in clear block letters, Sarah Whitmore, 1887, taken. Just below it, slightly smaller but equally precise. Jacob Mendoza, 1889, silence kept. And another. Emma Castellano, 1891, never found. Carmen's voice came out barely above a whisper. Elena, what is this? Elena didn't answer immediately. She moved slowly along the curved wall, her fingers tracing the carved letters, feeling the depth of each groove, the texture of stone that had been deliberately marked and left for someone to find. More names revealed themselves in the harsh work light. Thomas Gray, 1883, drowned. Maria Sandoval, 1890, burned. Children of Riverside, 1892, lost. The carvings weren't random graffiti. They followed a clear pattern, a timeline that spiraled upward around the interior circumference of the tower. The earliest dates were near the bottom, 1872, 1875, 1878, and they climbed steadily higher as the years progressed, circling the tower like a macabre calendar. Some entries were accompanied by crude but careful sketches: a house, a tree, a cross, a river. Others had only initials or single devastating words: accident, fire, disappeared, forgotten. Elena's professional mind tried to make sense of it. This wasn't vandalism. This was documentation. Someone had spent years, maybe decades, carving these records into stone with painstaking care. This is a memorial, Elena said slowly, her voice echoing slightly in the cylindrical space. Or a ledger. Someone was keeping track. Of what? Carmen asked, though the tremor in her voice suggested she already understood. People, Elena said quietly. Deaths. Disappearances. They were keeping a record of people who were lost. Carmen moved her light higher, illuminating the upper sections of the wall where the spiral continued. The dates climbed into the 1890s, then the early 1900s, becoming slightly more erratic, the handwriting changing subtly, as if different people had taken over the task. Near what appeared to be the end of the timeline, around 1905, the carvings became more cryptic. The count continues. 23 years. They must not forget. And then, abruptly, the carving stopped. The stone above that point was blank, unmarked, as if whoever had been maintaining this terrible record had simply ceased one day and never returned. Elena's chest felt tight. She'd worked on dozens of old structures, homesteads where families had lived and died, churches where generations had worshipped, even an old prison once. But she'd never felt anything like this. The tower wasn't just old. It was haunted by purpose, by someone's desperate need to make sure these names, these people, these losses weren't erased. Carmen's light suddenly stopped on a section of wall about 6 feet up, near Elena's eye level. Elena, she said, her voice tight. Look at this one. Elena stepped closer and felt ice form in her stomach. Morales family, 1903, vanished from Canyon Road. Her own family name, carved into this tower 20 years before she was born. Elena had heard the story from her grandmother when she was young. A branch of the Morales family that had lived somewhere in Silverstone Valley had disappeared around the turn of the century. Just gone one day. The official story was that they'd moved away, possibly to California or Mexico, seeking better opportunities. No one had heard from them again, but that wasn't uncommon in those days. People moved. People lost touch. People started over. But this carving suggested something different. Vanished. Not moved. Not relocated. Vanished. That's your family, Carmen said unnecessarily. Elena nodded, unable to speak. Her hand moved almost involuntarily to touch the carved letters of her family name, feeling the grooves that someone had cut into this stone more than a century ago. Someone had thought it important enough to record. Someone had wanted this remembered. She stepped back, trying to clear her head, trying to think like a stonemason instead of a descendant. But the professional distance wouldn't come. We need to document this, Elena said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Every name, every date, every symbol, before we do anything else. Carmen pulled out her phone and started taking photographs, the camera flash creating stark shadows that made the names seem to leap from the stone. And then what? She asked. Do we still tear it down? Elena thought of Victoria Brennan's check sitting in her bank account, thought of the contract she'd signed, the clause about disposing of discovered materials without preservation. Thought of that desperate edge in Victoria's voice. Some things are better left in the past. First we find out who built this tower, Elena said quietly. and why someone thought these people needed to be remembered. Then we decide what to do. Carmen lowered her camera, her face pale in the reflected light. Elena, what if someone doesn't want us to find out? It was a good question. The kind of question Elena should have asked herself before signing that contract. The kind of question that usually came right before things got complicated and dangerous. Outside, the wind picked up, rushing past the tower's opening with a sound almost like breathing. Almost like a warning. Elena looked one more time at the spiral of names climbing the walls, at the decades of loss carved into stone, at her own family name among the forgotten. Then we'll be careful, she said. But we're going to find out anyway. 3 weeks before Elena Morales signed Victoria Brennan's contract, she sat at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at a stack of overdue bills that refused to shrink no matter how many times she reorganized them. The numbers were unforgiving. Mortgage payment, $1,240, 2 months behind. Truck payment, $485, 1 month late. Equipment loan, $320. Utilities, $178. Insurance, $290. Groceries on credit, $156. Total owed immediately, $2,669. Cash and checking account, $147. The math was simple and brutal. Without new work in the next 2 weeks, she'd lose the truck. Without the truck, she couldn't work. Without work, everything else would follow like dominoes. The equipment, the tiny house she'd bought 5 years ago, the business license, the reputation she'd spent nearly 3 decades building. Elena pressed her palms against her eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion and stone dust that never completely washed away no matter how hard she scrubbed. She was 49 years old, one of the best stonemasons in 3 counties, and she was about to lose everything because the world had decided it didn't need her particular skills anymore. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carmen. Still awake? Want company? Elena smiled despite herself. Carmen had an uncanny ability to sense when Elena was spiraling. She texted back, go to sleep. Work tomorrow. You should too. Worrying doesn't pay bills. Neither does sleeping. Fair point. Night, boss. Elena set the phone down and looked around her small kitchen. The house was modest, but hers, or would be, in another 23 years when the mortgage was paid off. Assuming she made it that long. The walls were decorated with photos spanning decades. Elena at 18, covered in limestone dust on her first job site, grinning like she'd discovered gold. Elena at 25, shaking hands with the contractor who'd given her first solo project. Elena at 32, standing beside the massive stone archway she'd built for the Riverside Historic Church, the project that had made her reputation. And then, on the far wall, the photo that still hurt to look at even after 7 years. Elena and her husband Marcus, standing in front of their newly purchased house, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. Marcus had died 3 years after that photo was taken. Heart attack at 46, sudden and complete, leaving Elena with a mortgage, a business to run alone, and a grief that had slowly hardened into something she could carry but never quite put down. She'd kept the business going, kept working, kept moving forward because that's what you did. But the industry had changed. Younger workers with lower overhead could underbid her. Corporate contractors with bulk purchasing power could source materials cheaper. And clients, even ones who appreciated quality craftsmanship, ultimately chose price over experience when their budgets were tight. Elena had tried everything. She'd lowered her rates until she was barely breaking even. She'd taken on smaller jobs, residential repairs, garden walls, anything to keep money flowing. She'd trained apprentices like Carmen, hoping to build a team that could take on bigger projects, but that required capital she didn't have. She'd even considered leaving Silverstone Valley entirely, moving to a city where construction was booming, but the thought of abandoning the community where she'd built her reputation, where Marcus was buried, where her grandmother had lived until she was 93, it felt like surrender. So she stayed, and she struggled, and she stared at bills at 2 in the morning, wondering how much longer she could hold on. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, something the old woman had said near the end of her life. We come from people who survived impossible things, Mija. That's in your blood. You'll find a way. Elena wasn't sure she believed in inherited resilience anymore, but she wanted to. God, she wanted to. The next morning, exhausted and running on coffee, Elena stopped at the general store in town to pick up supplies. Silverstone Valley was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, usually before you knew it yourself. The store was run by Margaret Shun, a woman in her 70s who'd been behind that counter for as long as Elena could remember. "You look tired," Margaret said without preamble as Elena set a box of work gloves and a pack of marking chalk on the counter. "I am tired," Elena replied. "No point in pretending otherwise." Margaret rang up the items slowly, her arthritic fingers moving with practiced care. "Heard work's been slow." "It has been." "Also heard Victoria Brennan's been looking for someone to deal with that old tower on her property." Margaret said it casually, but there was something deliberate in her tone, something that suggested this wasn't idle gossip. Elena's interest sharpened. "The stone tower? Out past the eastern boundary." "That's the one. She's been trying to get rid of it for years. Offered a few contractors good money to demolish it, but none of them would touch it after they went out to look at it." Margaret paused, studying Elena's face. "Might be worth asking her about it. If you're looking for work, why wouldn't they touch it?" Elena asked. Margaret's expression shifted, something guarded sliding behind her eyes. "You'd have to ask them. But I'll tell you what I know, which isn't much and might be nothing but old stories. That tower's been there since before my mother was born. Some folks say it was built by a mining company in the 1870s. Others say it was part of a ranch operation that went under. Nobody really knows for sure, and nobody seems too interested in finding out." "But," Elena pressed, sensing there was more. Margaret lowered her voice, even though they were alone in the store. "But about 15 years ago, a surveyor went out there to assess it for Victoria. He spent maybe an hour inside, came back white as milk, and refused to say what he'd seen. Just said he wouldn't touch the project for any amount of money. 2 other contractors after him had similar reactions. Victoria stopped trying for a while, but lately she's been asking around again. More desperate this time." Elena felt that familiar tingle of curiosity mixed with caution. "Desperate how?" "The kind of desperate that makes a woman pay someone to do a job instead of charging them for salvage rights." Margaret handed Elena her change. "Just thought you should know. If you decide to talk to her, be careful. There's history in this valley that some people would rather stay buried." Elena pocketed the change, her mind already working through the possibilities. A demolition job with payment up front? That could solve her immediate problems. The stone alone would be valuable. And if contractors were turning it down, that meant less competition. "Thanks for the tip," Elena said. Margaret nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Elena? My mother used to say that some jobs cost more than they pay. Just keep that in mind." Elena left the store with those words following her like a shadow. But when she got home and looked at those bills again, at the final notice stamps and the collection agency warnings, the choice seemed clear. She couldn't afford philosophy. She needed work. She drafted the proposal to Victoria Brennan that night. "We should call someone," Carmen said, her voice echoing slightly in the cylindrical space. She was still photographing the walls, but her hands were shaking. "Police, maybe? Or historians. This is important. These are people's lives." Elena nodded slowly, but her practical mind was already seeing the complications. "And tell them what? That we found old carvings in a tower we've been hired to demolish? That we think these names represent something suspicious even though most of these dates are from over 100 years ago?" "Yes," Carmen said firmly. "Exactly that. They'll tell us it's interesting, maybe send someone to document it. And then what? We still have a contract. Victoria still wants this gone. And if we refuse to do the work, she'll just find someone else, someone who won't ask questions or take photographs first." Carmen lowered her camera, frustration clear on her young face. "So we just what? Tear it down and pretend we never saw this. And then we decide what to do with what we know." Elena pulled out her own phone and started taking photographs from a different angle. "But we do it carefully. Because Victoria Brennan didn't pay me $400 to demolish this tower. She paid me $400 to make it disappear. And people don't pay to make things disappear unless they're afraid of what might be found." They worked in silence for the next hour, photographing every section of wall, every name, every inscription. Elena made careful notes about the pattern, the progression of dates, the changes in handwriting that suggested multiple people had contributed to the record over time. Carmen sketched the layout of the interior, marking which sections had the densest concentration of names. When they finally emerged from the tower, The sun was past its peak and the air had grown colder. Storm clouds were gathering on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of the valley's first winter rain. But nothing about this was simple anymore. "Elena," Carmen said softly, "what if your family really did vanish? What if whatever happened to them happened to all these other people too? What if someone made them disappear?" Elena had been trying not to think about that, trying not to imagine her great-great-grandparents, people she'd never known but who'd carried her name and her blood, caught up in something terrible, trying not to connect the dots between 100 carved names and a pattern of loss that spanned decades. "Then we find out what happened," Elena said, "and we make sure whoever's responsible doesn't get to erase the evidence." Carmen nodded, but her expression was troubled. "Victoria Brennan is one of the most powerful people in this valley. If she's connected to this somehow, if her family was involved, then we'll deal with that when we know more," Elena interrupted, though the same thoughts had been circling in her own mind. "Right now, we need information. Facts, not speculation." They loaded their tools back into Elena's truck in silence. As they drove away from the tower, Elena glanced in her rearview mirror and saw it standing alone against the darkening sky, a gray sentinel marking the boundary between the valley's present and its buried past. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Victoria Brennan's number. Elena's stomach tightened, but she answered. "This is Elena. Ms. Morales." Victoria's voice was crisp, businesslike. "I wanted to check on your progress. Have you begun the demolition?" "Not yet. I'm still assessing the structure, making sure I have the right equipment for safe removal." The lie came easily, smoothly, and Elena felt a twist of something uncomfortable in her chest. A pause. Then, "How long will assessment take?" "A few more days. The tower's more structurally sound than I expected. I want to make sure we don't have any collapses during demolition. Safety first." Another lie, piling on top of the first. Another pause, longer this time. When Victoria spoke again, her tone had shifted subtly. "Ms. Morales, I trust you remember the terms of our contract. 60 days for complete demolition. No preservation of materials found on site. No archival documentation." Elena's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "I remember." "Good. Because I've had contractors in the past who got distracted, started asking questions about the tower's history instead of focusing on the work. Those contracts were terminated, and those contractors found it difficult to get other work in this valley. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The threat was barely veiled, clear enough to be unmistakable, subtle enough to be deniable. "I understand," Elena said, keeping her voice neutral. "You want the job done efficiently and without complications." "Exactly. I'm glad we're on the same page. I'll expect an update in 1 week." Victoria hung up before Elena could respond. Carmen, who'd been listening from the passenger seat, stared at Elena with wide eyes. "She knows. Or suspects. Elena, she basically just threatened you." Elena set the phone in the cup holder and focused on the road. "She's worried. Which means there's definitely something to find. People don't threaten contractors over routine demolition jobs. So what do we do?" Elena thought about the bills stacked on her kitchen table. Thought about the truck payment due in 3 weeks and the mortgage payment due in 4. Thought about Victoria Brennan's check sitting in her bank account, already spent on immediate debts. Thought about her grandmother's voice. "We come from people who survived impossible things." And she thought about those names carved into stone, about the person who'd spent years making sure they weren't forgotten, about her own family name among the vanished. "We find out the truth," Elena said. "And we do it in the next 6 days before Victoria expects that update. Because once we know what really happened, we'll know what we're really dealing with. And then we decide whether $400 is worth becoming part of a cover-up." Carmen was quiet for a long moment. Then, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." Elena wished she felt as certain, but all she felt was tired, scared, and committed to a path that seemed to grow more dangerous with every mile. Behind them, the tower disappeared into the gathering storm, its secrets still locked in stone, still waiting to be freed or buried forever. The choice, Elena realized with cold clarity, was now hers to make.